This is Little Green Ghouls, and welcome back to Goosebumps Revisited, a series where I break down a classic Goosebumps book and any episode that goes along with it. I will also be telling some of Goosebumps cliches and classic moments. This week, I'm excited to visit Revenge of the Lawn Gnomes. This was one I was looking forward to because I've always enjoyed the cover and the title's intriguing. I probably read this as a kid, but I can see why it wasn't super memorable. It's a fun concept that doesn't get too exciting until about the last 20 pages. One of my commenters, Mr. Mortman, pointed out it's very similar to Night of the Living Dummy, and I have to agree with that analysis. I would still recommend checking it out, even if it's not one of the stronger books in the series. I really like the cover for the original 1995 one. There's a lot of little details to check out with all the different lawn decorations, and the gnomes themselves do a nice job of looking like a mix of a little menacing and mischievous. I feel like this is common knowledge at this point, but I guess Jacobus originally had the gnome on the left picking his nose, but Scholastic didn't like that and had to move the finger to this odd thinking pose. The 2004 slime border darkens the image and removes some of the sparkle the original had. I think there are pros and cons to this. In some ways it makes the picture a bit clearer, but it also kind of dulls it a bit. I think the matching green border creates just too much green, but it doesn't look bad by any means. The 2011 cover goes its own direction, and I think these gnomes look a bit more like the classic gnomes I think of when picturing lawn gnomes. I like the details to Chip's chipped tooth, and that we have more than two gnomes, so it kind of hints at later events in the story. Overall, I think it's a solid cover and one of the better remakes. Revenge of the Lawn Gnomes had less merchandise than I thought it would. We have a hologram keychain, like we've seen with some of the other books. Revenge of the Lawn Gnomes is also featured an Ice Chips candy, which I've never heard of, and honestly, after reading about them, they don't sound particularly tasty to me. Our front take says, "Keep off their grass." And the back take says, "Someone's been stalking in my garden," which maybe somebody in the comments knows what this is referencing, because I don't. So let's read this blurb on the back. Two pink flamingos, a whole family of plaster skunks. Joe Burton's dad loves tacky lawn ornaments. But then he brings home two ugly lawn gnomes, and that's when the trouble starts. Late at night when everybody's asleep, someone's creeping in the garden, whispering nasty things, smashing melons, squashing tomatoes. No way two old dumb lawn ornaments could be causing all this trouble, is there? Okay, on to our summary. The book opens with our introduction to Joe Burton, who introduces himself in the third person for some reason. It was a hot, sticky June afternoon, the first Monday of summer vacation, and Joe Burton had made another excellent shot. That's me, Joe Burton. I'm 12, and there's nothing I like better than slamming the ball in my sister's face and making her chase after it. I'm not a bad sport, I just like to show Minnie that she's not as great as she thinks she is. You might guess that Minnie and I do not always agree on things. The fact is, I'm not really like anybody in my family. Mindy, Mom, and my dad are all blonde, skinny, and tall, and I have brown hair, and I'm kind of pudgy and short. I kind of underestimated just how short Joe is, but then he complains about having a hard time seeing over the ping pong net, so Joe is like 3 feet tall, and that's being generous. We also get a glimpse into the psyche of his sister Mindy, and this girl probably has some things going on. She arranges her book collection in alphabetical order via author, has her own private card catalog for her book collection, arranges her closet in rainbow order, eats her plate clockwise every time. Mindy honestly kind of sounds a lot like my sister. Joe has an interesting take on this. Me, I'm not organized, I'm cool. I'm not serious like my sister. I can be pretty funny. My friends think I'm a riot. Everybody does. We'll just see how funny Joe is, because generally, when Stein's protagonists declare themselves funny, it becomes code for insufferable. I just hope Joe doesn't have a friend group we have to put up with. Joe then proves my concerns are valid by shouting, "Oh my god, there's a spider on your shoulder" at Mindy, who shrieks and drops the ping pong ball and declares Joe's a cheater, causing Joe to respond, "At least I'm a funny cheater." So this is the level of humor we're going to be dealing with in this book. I also want to point out we are now on page 5 of this detailed ping pong game, and it really does not warrant 5 pages of description. Joe tries to distract Mindy again by saying she has snot hanging out of her nose, but it doesn't work this time. Again, Joe is just hilarious. The two kids then become very concerned that Buster, the family Rottweiler, isn't snoozing in the corner of the basement like usual. Honestly, he probably was just sick of 5 pages of awful banter too and left. I guess Mindy is worried about Buster's whereabouts because he has a history of destroying their neighbor's, Mr. McCall's garden. Buster is apparently a vegetable-hungry dog that has eaten all of Mr. McCall's tomatoes, lettuce, and zucchini before, in addition to digging holes all over his yard. I'd probably be pissed too if Buster destroyed all of my hard work. There's also an element of competition between Mr. McCall and Joe's dad, because they both like to compete in local garden shows. Maybe the dad is the one eating Mr. McCall's veggies and blaming the dog out of sabotage? That'd be a fun twist. Mr. McCall has a trick up his sleeve this year though, and has planted top-secret cassava melons, even though they're not really suited for Minnesota according to Joe's dad. We learn all this while still playing ping pong because this game just won't end. Well, it kinda ends in an attempt at a chapter cliffhanger, where Joe suddenly screams, "Oh no, Mr. McCall is right behind you." I don't know what this man has done to these children, but Mindy's response is not normal. All the color drained from Mindy's face. Her hand grasped the paddle so tightly her knuckles turned white. She tried to swing around to look behind her, but she couldn't. Her feet were frozen in her ping pong footprints. I thought once we discovered this was just Mr. McCall's son Moose, we would be free of ping pong, but no, it goes on for another 4 pages. It's kinda crazy how I can tell which books have an actual plot in mind just based off the tone of the first couple chapters. This unfortunately isn't one of them, because this has just been 11 pages of filler. I mentioned this before, but there's a direct correlation between the amount of jokes and pranks a Goosebumps book has and the lack of plot. I'll spare you the pages of ping pong and summarize. Moose is incredibly strong, to the point he flattens ping pong balls by accident. Mindy hates Moose. Joe can't stop making incredibly lame jokes, and Moose pretends to kill Joe to scare Mindy. It's riveting stuff. By page 14, we're finally free of ping pong and have shifted the focus back to Buster, because he's over in Mr. McCall's vegetable garden wreaking havoc. The kids race to the yard and discover Buster digging up prized melons and ignoring the kids' demands. Joe busts out the dog whistle on Buster, which gets him to leave, but it's too late. Mr. McCall is already outside. This book is really structured like we're supposed to fear Mr. McCall, but it's kinda hard to give a shit. Nothing really happens. Mr. McCall threatens that if Buster's in his yard again, he'll call the pound, which is kind of an empty threat since I thought that was already the case and Buster was literally just in his yard. We then have Joe's dad appear on the scene, stating that he has something terrible to tell the children. He found a fruit fly on their biggest tomato, the Red Queen. This definitely warranted a chapter cliffhanger setup. This book is kinda lazy so far. This fruit fly also launches us into multiple pages of tomato care and pest control discussion. The dad is not an organic gardener and has all three of them spray the tomatoes with pesticide to kill the one fruit fly he spotted. Thankfully, their mom appears to get us off of fucking tomatoes, announces that dinner is at 7:30. The dad decides this gives him enough time to go lawn ornament shopping, and this I can get on board with because I love tacky lawn decorations. We have 2 plastic flamingos, a cement angel with huge white wings, a chrome ball on a silver platform, a whole family of plaster skunks, a fountain with 2 kissing swans, a seal that balances a beach ball on its nose, and a chipped plaster deer. The dad even goes the extra mile to dress the decorations for various holidays, including pilgrims for Thanksgiving, and top hats and beards for Lincoln's birthday, so I admire the dedication. They only live 2 blocks away from Lawn Lovely, so they all proceed to walk over. It's June and hot, so everybody's all sweaty, and since Joe is just so funny, he proceeds to shake sweat all over Mindy. What a prankster. We reach Lawn Lovely, which apparently is a store focusing solely on lawn ornaments, and also attached to an old crazy lady's house. The dad makes a beeline for 2 ugly little gnomes. I stared at the gnomes. They looked like little old men. They are about 3 feet tall and very chubby, with piercing red eyes and large pointy ears. Their mouths curved into wide silly grins, and their coarse brown hair sprouted from their heads. Each gnome wore a bright green short sleeve shirt, brown leggings, and a tall pointy orange hat. Both wore black belts tied tightly around their chubby waists. I thought Miss Anderson would be like, no, you can't have these gnomes, they're cursed or something. But nope, she just takes the credit card and sends the family on their way. Joe of course has to seize the opportunity to be a prankster and pretends a gnome won't let him go to scare Mindy. The dad is a man after my own heart, insists on naming the gnomes, just like the rest of the lawn ornaments. He ends up naming them Hap and Chip, because one looks so happy and the other has a chip on its tooth. They head home with the gnomes, which are surprisingly heavy, and it takes both Mindy and Joe to carry one while the dad staggers along with the other. Everybody is stopping and staring at them, which Mindy finds humiliating. I just can't imagine giving a shit about somebody carrying a lawn decoration, but I guess this is something that warrants mentioning, and it's about as exciting as the last 34 pages have been. Moose comes over to see the ugly gnomes, and then Joe and him proceed to pretend to beat up the gnomes for an entire page. Moose leaned down and stuck his tongue out at Hap. "You want to fight, Shrimp?" he asked the little statue. "Take that." He pretended to punch Hap in the chubby chest. "Wreck the runt," I cried. Moose grabbed the gnome around the waist and gave him a dozen quick punches. I scrambled to my feet. "I'll wipe that ugly grin off your face," I yelled at Chip. I closed my hands around the gnome's neck and pretended to choke him. "Watch this." Moose shot out a thick leg and karate kicked Hap in the small pointy hat. The squat figure wobbled. "Careful, stop messing around," Mindy warned. "You're gonna break them." "Okay," I said. "Let's tickle them." "Tickle, tickle," Moose squeaked as he tickled Hap under the armpits. This book is just full of scenes like this, and I want to know what kids found it appealing. Probably the same ones who liked Evan from Monster Blood. Joe is just very odd. The gnome wrestling suddenly is interrupted because Mindy notices Buster is over in the neighbor's yard again, digging up the garden. Like, I love dogs, but if I was Mr. McCall, I'd be over this shit too. Watch your dog, get a rope or get a fence, but you can't just let your dog destroy the neighbor's yard multiple times a day. That makes you a piece of shit owner. Joe gets Buster back via dog whistle, and Buster stops to lick Hap, who is face down on the ground for some reason. Joe picks up the gnome and is startled when the gnome's face no longer looks like a cheerful grin, but it looks like it's angrily screaming. Joe's dad comes to investigate, but the gnome is right back to grinning. Everybody assumes it's just Joe joking around because that's all he's done this entire book, and Joe thinks he must have just be seeing things. The subject shifts back to Buster, and the dad says if Buster goes next door one more time, they'll have to tie him up, which the kids think is just the end of the world. But it's like, you guys gotta do something. You can't just keep letting your dog trash the neighbor's property. The next morning, and a page and a half later, we're right back to garden drama with Mr. McCall. As Joe's heading out to mow the lawn, he's suddenly screamed at. Apparently somebody has trashed Mr. McCall's garden and destroyed one of his prized melons. Buster is getting the blame, but we are quickly approaching the midpoint of this book without any lawn gnome action, so it's pretty safe to assume Buster is innocent. The dad has Joe tie Buster up over by his doghouse, and we learned it's probably for the best since painters are coming over to paint the house this afternoon. Joe is very upset by this because he hates the smell of paint and wasn't consulted. Joe sure has a lot of authority in this house. I can't imagine having an opinion on house paint as a kid. Joe gets started mowing the lawn, and the entire time he's loudly complaining how much he hates Mr. McCall for getting Buster in trouble, because yes, Mr. McCall is supposed to just let this dog destroy his garden. Moose shows up and wants to play ring toss. The two boys then proceed to use Hap and Chip as targets. As Joe is retrieving the rings off the gnomes, he notices a melon seed lodged into Chip's teeth. Joe can't think of any logical explanation and feels unsettled. We then cut to later and have this great sentence: "I dreamed about melons that night." No, not those melons. Joe had a nightmare about cassava melons growing out of control and eventually bigger than his house. This startles him awake and he hears Buster howling pitifully in the backyard and decides to go visit him. While sneaking out of the house, we're treated to a shoulder scare via Mindy. She demands to know what he's doing, but never really explains why her ass is up either. While he's outside, he sees two small figures scamper off by the house and concludes it must be raccoons, and has an aha moment where he thinks raccoons must have destroyed the melons. He comforts Buster and heads back to bed. The next morning, he's awoken by Mr. McCall's screams. The whole family races outside, and Joe assumes the raccoons must have struck again, but they discover somebody's drawn smiley faces with black marker all over the melons. Mindy immediately throws Joe under the bus and is like, "How could you?" She announces to both families that she caught Joe sneaking out last night, and Joe's dad explodes at him. Joe ends up being grounded for 2 weeks, and Mr. McCall threatens to sue. Joe meanders around the house, attempting to find chaos to cause. The best he can do is shuffle Mindy's clothes out of color order. Eventually, his mom gets sick of him and allows him to go take Buster for a walk, where they play fetch at the pond. This is all way more detailed than it needs to be, but based off the quality of the rest of this story, I think we have a page count situation going on here. When they finally get home, Joe takes a look at the lawn gnomes and notices black paint on their hands. This is damning evidence, even though it was said to be black marker earlier, but whatever. While examining the gnomes, Buster is back in Mr. McCall's garden, because at this point, I think Buster has a vendetta. Luckily for everyone, Joe gets Buster back before he can do any real damage. Buster licks the gnomes, and once again their faces change from happy grins to horrified. Joe races to get his mom, but when she takes a look at the gnomes, they look as cheerful as ever. She tells him to piss off and read a book or something. Then Joe is sitting in the yard, concluding that the gnomes must be alive, when he hears them whisper, "Not funny, Joe. Not funny at all." At dinner, he tries to tell everybody what he heard, and they're like, "Enough with these goddamn gnome jokes, Joe." After dinner, they head to the water the tomatoes, only to discover that somebody has smashed them all. Joe thinks this is the perfect opportunity to prove that it was the gnomes, but surprise, surprise, they don't buy this. I was thinking that Dad would blame Joe, but he thinks Mr. McCall did it as an act of revenge and races over to confront the giant neighbor. Mr. McCall opens the door while holding a half-eaten pork chop, which is funnier than anything Joe's done in this story. Joe's dad then throws a smashed tomato at Mr. McCall and storms off. Imagine being Mr. McCall in this story. He's living with nightmare neighbors. The two dads proceed to get in a shouting match over the blue ribbon from the garden show last year, and ends up with Joe and Moose no longer being allowed to talk to each other. That night, Joe wakes up from dreams of lawn gnomes, and he's gazing out of his window. He notices that the gnomes are gone. Joe tries and fails to wake up his whole family, but they're like, "Shut the fuck up. Quit trying to trick us with all this gnome nonsense." Joe has no choice but to race outside into the fog alone, although I'm not sure what he thinks he's going to accomplish if no one else will come look at the gnomes with him. While racing through the fog, something suddenly gets him by the ankle, and his first thought is either a gnome or a snake has him. And the moment I read snake, I knew it would be a garden hose, because we have had multiple stories now where the Goosebumps protagonist thinks a garden hose is a snake. Stein has some sort of personal fear of hoses going on that he's assuming is universal. After his ordeal with the hose, Joe decides to head back inside, but that's when he hears soft footsteps in the fog. He hears a raspy cackle and is suddenly grabbed around the waist in a chapter cliffhanger. This just ends up being Moose, because in Goosebumps, kids are always running around at midnight looking for prime pranking opportunities. Joe tries to explain to Moose that the gnomes are missing, but he's not buying it. And before Joe can show him, both dads are outside trying to figure out what all the noise is. Both kids get their asses chewed out and head inside. Joe is able to convince his dad to come see that the gnomes are missing, but of course, they're right where they should be. He goes to bed, and he wakes up the next morning, only to discover Mr. McCall's Jeep is covered in white paint. He spots Moose next to the car and goes to ask him what happened. Moose shares that his dad has already called the police, and they're going to investigate and arrest whoever did it. Moose is freaking out because he thinks both him and Joe will be blamed because everybody knows they were out last night. Joe then notices white little footprints leading from the Jeep to the lawn gnomes and tries his best to convince Moose that this is damning evidence. Moose isn't convinced but agrees to meet that night to help catch the lawn gnomes in the act. We're on page 83, so we jump right into that night with a gnome stakeout. It's midnight and both boys are sitting in a bush staring at lawn gnomes. We get a brief fake out where Joe suddenly has two tiny glowing eyes right in his face, which ends up just belonging to a raccoon. I feel this warrants a chapter cliffhanger scare because a raccoon will fuck you up, but it's played off as no big deal. The boys then spend the next 2 hours in the bush, and just when Moose is ready to call it quits, the gnomes suddenly come to life. They stretch their little arms and begin walking around. At first, they think they've been spotted, and it seems like the gnomes are racing right at them, but the gnomes end up going a different direction. Moose is in shock, but agrees to follow the gnomes. They spot the gnomes next to Buster's doghouse prying open cans of black paint. The boys then just watch as the gnomes fling black paint all over the side of their freshly painted white house. They decide they have to do something, and Moose suggests that they just tackle them. He goes to pounce but gets tangled in Buster's rope, which wakes the dog, who begins barking like crazy. This causes the gnomes to notice the two boys, and we end the chapter with Chip declaring, "Get them! Don't let them escape!" They take off running, but we learn that Joe is very out of shape and can't even make it around the house without getting a cramp bad enough that he drops to the ground. Moose is screaming for help at the top of his lungs, but the only person who appears is Mindy, who wants to know what all the screaming is about. Before Joe can warn her, the gnomes pounce on her. They force her arms behind her back and drag her out into the street. Moose and Joe chase after them, and once a few houses down, the gnomes finally release Mindy. The gnomes then explain that they mean them no harm, and they are mischief elves, and their sole purpose in life is to cause mischief. They then say, without them, the world would be a pretty dull place. Hap and Chip proceed to tell us their backstory. They used to live in a land far away and worked in mines in a forest, but the forest was chopped down and they were kidnapped and forced to work as lawn ornaments. Hap doubles down on this and says that they are slaves, forced to stand all day and night. What is it with Stein and slavery? The gnomes then beg the kids to help free them so they can return to the forest and live how they want. The gnomes want the kids to return to Lawn Lovely and help them free 6 other gnomes from the basement so they all can return to the forest together. The kids debate among themselves and settle on helping the gnomes escape. They walk over to Lawn Lovely, and these gnomes are very insistent that the kids crawl into the basement window. Considering they're mischief elves, I would have my reservations about trusting these little guys. The 3 kids lower themselves into the basement, and the moment they're down there, Hap and Chip take off running while giggling. The lights flash on, and they realize they're in a room full of 600 gnomes, all lined up like little soldiers. This part of the book is actually interesting. Sometimes I wonder why Stein, and or his ghostwriters, waste so much time adding filler to the start of these books, versus just going wild with scenes like these. They spot Hap and Chip at the back of the room, who clap 3 times and bring the room full of gnomes to life. Hap and Chip announce that they have brought them, the young humans, and kept their promise. Mindy tries to tell them they're here to free them, but the gnomes announce that they don't want to be free, and they're going to have a lot more fun now that they're here. The gnomes debate whether they want to dribble, fold, bounce, or tickle the kids. Joe screams quiet and threatens to wake Miss Anderson, but the gnomes just laugh because they know her old ass can't hear anything. The gnomes then move on to debating whether they should play tug-of-war with the kids, when Joe hears Buster's bark in the distance. Joe remembers how scared the gnomes seemed to be of Buster before, and so all 3 kids begin shouting for Buster. He appears in the window, but he isn't quite grasping that he needs to hop down. Despite the kids' pleas, he eventually turns around and walks away. I'm assuming this is when Joe will remember his dog whistle, but there's also a good chance that this will take a few more pages. Meanwhile, the gnomes have added using the kids as trampolines to their list of tortures. It only takes a page and Joe remembers the whistle. He goes to blow it, but Hap and Chip knock it out of his hands and across the room. We then spend the next chapter wrestling gnomes for the whistle. Moose fights off 4 of them while Mindy tries her best to fight a group of them too. Eventually Hap gets the whistle and dramatically goes to stomp on it with his foot, only to have Joe grab it just in time and blow. The kids all stare at the window waiting for Buster, but we've established Buster doesn't listen to shit, so he doesn't show up. The kids then all realize it's awfully quiet, and they turn around to see that all the gnomes are back in a trance. So they weren't afraid of Buster, they were afraid of the whistle. They then stand on Chip and Hap to crawl to the basement window, where they see Buster happily wagging his tail. I don't really get why these kids didn't smash the shit out of all these gnomes now that they're frozen, but they didn't. We jump to the next night, and Joe and Mindy are watching MTV when their dad arrives home. Their mom warns them to be nice to Dad since he's upset that somebody kidnapped his lawn gnomes. The dad has a surprise though, and given that it's the last page, it better be a good one. He takes them outside to admire this 8-foot tall plaster gorilla that he just purchased from Lawn Lovely, and as Joe is turning to head back inside, the gorilla winks at him. And that's how this one ends, with an 8-foot tall plaster gorilla getting ready to cause trouble. Revenge of the Lawn Gnomes earned its own episode, and I think it's a pretty solid adaptation. Our notable actor this week is Peter Kelligan, as the dad, who appeared in an absolute shit ton of shows, but not a whole lot I recognize because I'm not Canadian, although he was Ranger Gord in The Red Green Show, which I have very vague memories of watching on PBS late at night as a kid. Okay, let's start the episode. We saw this same setup with the Scarecrow Walks at Midnight.
Come on, throw it right. Here, how's this?
These are some big-ass lawn gnomes.
Oh, wow. Real scary.
I have questionable taste, and I don't think even I could pretend these are cute.
I don't know. They're kind of evil looking.
Evil?
I think they're cute.
I think I'd gather more junk just to piss this guy off.
These are the most ridiculous looking things I've ever seen. When are you gonna wise up and get rid of all this junk?
Our classic lurking in the dark shots. The poor Major's melons.
What's up?
Well, Joe, apparently somebody smashed the Major's melons last night.
Could do this.
Whoa.
This was like an ugly ornament jump scare. I want to know why he had to lick his finger first. I think the makeup effects on these two little gnomes are pretty good. I'll always love shots of glowing eyes in the dark because it reminds me of shining lights in the woods as a kid and freaking myself out. I'd be screaming bloody murder if I witnessed this. I like that they made Mr. McCall ex-military.
Good. Okay, that's enough of a break. All this manure over to the corner bed. On the double!
Mindy lounging like fashionista royalty is a nice touch.
If you ask nicely, the gnomes will finish your yard work for you, and then you can kick back with me.
I commend this child for thinking to grab a video camera, but he loses major points for forgetting the tape. I'm enjoying this extended chase sequence.
Enjoy your trip.
Are you okay?
Don't you know anything about gnomes? It's what we do. I know. We can stick with them like bugs.
The flashlight freezing them is a bit anticlimactic, but no worse than a dog whistle.
Look what you did!
That's it. Hold it right there or I'll turn you into Mount Rushmore.
This episode is mostly just gnome chase sequences, which isn't the worst thing.
Come on!
Mindy, run!
This just gave me a flashback to watching this as a kid and not liking the gnome's pointy teeth.
I've had it with this junk. Gonna get rid of it once and for all.
This twist suits the episode well considering Mr. McCall sucks way more in the episode. Overall, I thought Revenge of the Lawn Gnomes was just okay. It takes a really long time to get going in comparison to other Goosebumps books, and the gnomes don't really do anything particularly creative with their mischief. I liked when we entered the basement full of evil gnomes, but that's pretty short-lived. I just found Joe to be really annoying and was tired of hearing about melons and tomatoes by the end of the book. I'll give this one 3 out of 5 fruit flies. It was just a mediocre book for me in the end. Okay, on to our totals. Revenge of the Lawn Gnomes didn't have any vomit, asshole victims, or it was only a dream, but it did have a couple of 90s moments. In Getting Jiggy with the 90s, we had 2 90s moments. These included an old school card catalog system from Mindy's personal library, and of course the ever-present MTV scene. This raises our total to 121 jiggy 90s moments. In It's a Prank Bro, I counted 4 pranks. These included a fake spider onto shoulder sighting, Moose pretending to kill Joe, a fake gnome attack via Joe, and when Moose scares Joe in the fog. This brings our series total to 78 It's a Prank Bros. We had another shoulder scare this week. This was when Joe is sneaking out of the house and is suddenly startled by Mindy. This raises our total to 20 shoulder scares. Revenge of the Lawn Gnomes had its fair share of chapter cliffhangers, with a total of 11. I thought the cliffhangers were nothing special in this one. This raises our Goosebumps total to 425. The clunky cliffhanger award for this book has to be when the dad has terrible news to share. He found a fruit fly. Shocker ending. Our big twist for this book was after leaving all the lawn gnomes intact in the basement, ready to come back to life at any point, the dad brings home an 8-foot giant plaster gorilla who winks at Joe. This brings our Goosebumps series total to 27. Well, that's it for Revenge of the Lawn Gnomes. This one really didn't do it for me, even though I was excited for it. I didn't think it was that bad though. Next week we have a shocker on Shock Street. And all I remember about this one was being disappointed by the ending, although I don't remember how it ended specifically. I think it may have had something to do with just being a ride the whole time, but I'm not sure. Let me know in the comments what you thought of Revenge of the Lawn Gnomes. How would you have solved the Buster situation? Did you find Joe remotely funny? How do you feel about lawn decorations? Also, what did you think of my tiny terror horror clips this week? Anyways, as always, thanks again for watching, and make sure you subscribe for
The pride. The love.